Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation on competence to consent to a search and seizure. My name is Rita Karambot, and today we will be discussing what it means for someone to be legally competent to consent to a search. This is important in protecting individual rights and ensuring law enforcement operates within legal boundaries. To start, let me define competence in the context of search and seizure. Competence refers to a person's ability to understand their legal rights and voluntarily agree to a search. This concept is tied closely to the Fourth Amendment, which protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. When we talk about competence to consent, we ask whether a person has mental capacity to understand what they are agreeing to and whether they are doing so freely. Understanding this is critical as it impacts the legality of searches conducted by law enforcement. So what are the legal criteria for determining whether someone is competent to consent to a search? There are really three main concepts. First, the individual must understand their rights, specifically their right to refuse a search. Second, they must also understand the potential consequences of consenting to a search. For example, they need to understand that allowing a search might lead to discovering evidence that could be used against them in court. Finally, their consent must be voluntary, meaning it was not the result of pressure or coercion from law enforcement. Each element is crucial to ensure the person's consent is valid. Several factors can affect whether a person is competent to consent to a search. First, cognitive abilities such as mental function play a significant role. If someone struggles to understand their rights, they may be unable to give valid consent. Mental health issues such as stress or mental disorders can also impair decision making. Someone's cultural background or language barrier are also additional factors that must be considered. For example, a person who comes from a culture where interactions with authority figures like police are viewed with fear they may feel compelled to consent even if they do not fully understand their rights. In some cultures, refusing law enforcement requests may be seen as inappropriate or dangerous, which can affect how voluntary their consent truly is. Language differences are also another critical factor. If a person does not speak English fluently or if legal terms are not translated correctly, they may not fully understand what they are consenting to. Without proper translation, they may not be able to grasp the consequences of agreeing to a search. These challenges can lead to consent that is not fully informed or voluntary, raising ethical and legal concerns. Age is another important factor because minors may not fully grasp the consequences of consenting to a search. Finally, the presence of coercion can undermine someone's voluntary consent. Even if someone does say yes to a search, it may not be considered valid if they feel pressured by law enforcement. All these factors must be considered when determining if a person is competent to consent. Courts use specific legal standards to assess whether someone was competent to consent. These tests are designed to determine whether the individuals understood their rights and could make a voluntary decision. Mental health professionals are often called upon to help evaluate competency in cases where it is unclear. Importantly, courts have overturned searches when consent was found to be involuntary, lacked probable cause, or have been found of coercion. This emphasizes the importance of consent being freely given without pressure. However, a person's consent can still be voluntary even if they do not know they have the right to refuse consent. This highlights the legal complexity of determining whether someone fully understood their rights while still meeting the legal definition of voluntary. In practice, courts rely on a variety of methods to evaluate whether a person was competent to consent to a search. Mental health professionals may interview the individual or conduct tests to assess their cognitive functioning. Courts also consider the specific circumstances surrounding the consent, such as whether the person was under duress or whether language barriers affected their understanding. One of the key challenges in these cases is determining whether the consent was truly voluntary or influenced by external factors like law enforcement pressure. If a court finds that someone is not competent, any evidence obtained through the search could be excluded from trial, as it would not be considered admissible. There are also important ethical considerations when it comes to competence in search and seizures. Vulnerable populations, such as individuals with mental health issues or minors or just any other factor that I discussed previously, need additional protection to ensure that their consent is valid. Law enforcement has an ethical responsibility to ensure that an individual is aware of their rights and that consent is given voluntarily. This is important in situations where people may be more easily coerced or confused, such as during stressful interactions with the police. Ensuring that consent is informed and voluntary protects both individual rights and the integrity of the legal system. For my media source, I provided a video where officers stop a suspect in connection with an Amber Alert. The officer requests consent to search the vehicle, but uses tactics that may make the consent less than entirely voluntary. He suggests that if the driver has nothing to hide, he should allow the search, creating pressure to comply. This is a critical example of how coercion can blur the line between voluntary and involuntary consent. Furthermore, the suspect may not fully understand his rights due to stress or cultural differences. The driver's cultural background may have influenced how he viewed law enforcement, potentially making him more likely to comply without fully understanding the consequences. This situation in this video also raises the question of whether someone could give informed consent when under stress. This connects to our earlier discussion on factors affecting competency, including culture and language. The officer's approach suggests that the driver may not have been aware he could refuse the search, but courts may still find it voluntary. It is a powerful demonstration of how competence is determined in real-world situations and how crucial it is to assess whether consent is truly informed. Before we conclude, I want to pose a discussion question to everyone. How should law enforcement determine whether someone is competent to consent to a search at the scene of a crime? And what factors should be considered while determining competency? Considering the factors we discussed, such as cognitive abilities, mental health, age, and coercion, I wonder which would weigh most heavily in making this determination. In conclusion, determining whether someone is competent to consent to a search is critical in ensuring that individual rights are respected. It requires careful consideration of cognitive abilities, mental health, how one volunteers, and understanding legal rights. By applying clear legal standards and ethical considerations, we can protect people from unlawful searches and ensure that the evidence gathered in legal proceedings is valid. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the discussion question. And here are my references.